Welcome back to another episode of the War Report, and we have quite a bit of news to cover. Everything from the situation in Ukraine right now, the Middle East, but probably the biggest news, which we'll get to later in the show, I want to end the show out with it, is electoral news in the United States and updates on Joe Biden's suspended campaign and the passing of the torch, in Biden's words, to Kamala Harris. We also have a little bit of news out of Europe, some interesting power plays when it comes to energy and the situation with Ukraine, and also some news here and there out of Western Europe, some follow up on the UK and the French elections. But we have a full show ahead of us, so I will not kick the can down the road any further, and I will get right into it with a brief Ukraine update. So it is reported that the losses of the AFU in Krinky at this point have been well over 5,000. Now, for those of you who haven't seen it yet, which I don't imagine is very many of you, I highly recommend you watch the new History Legends video about Krinky, and it's very telling. Now, it was always one of the, let's just say, harsher fronts for the Ukrainians, but I didn't quite realize how bad it was in terms of tactics, in terms of them using this city as a PR stunt, that the Ukrainian armed forces have thrown away the best, both in terms of motivation and in skill, of their troops to defend this bridgehead over the river without anything to supply it. Once again, the video I referenced goes into much more detail about this, which I highly recommend you watch. And I had covered last week that there had been 788 defections from this front, but casualties are well over 5,000. That's a larger estimate, so take everything with a grain of salt. But given the situation there, given how much of a deadlock it has been for the Ukrainians, I would not be at all surprised if it was true, if that figure was well over 5,000. And it does show how the AFU operates, how the AFU has operated this entire war with these PR offensives. The entire basis of the 2023 campaign was a PR offensive, was to gain the confidence of the Western backers in order to continue this war, in order to convince them that Ukraine is a cause still worth investing in. Because the fine line the Ukrainians have always had to walk in their propaganda since the start of this war is that if Ukraine does not receive the aid, it will collapse. However, it is also worth investing in because if you invest in us right now, we can triple it, we can deliver your investments, you'll have access to Ukraine's markets, you'll have access to Russia's market after they sign everything over to us in reparations. That has been the grift they have been selling the entire time. And a lot of Western investors, both on a state and a private level, have bought into that. And we'll see some of the prices they've paid later when it comes to the payout for their investment. And I'll just give you a hint right now, it wasn't very good. But to continue on northward, we do have Russian forces advancing in the Orkhov direction. Krasnogorovka has been reported to fall. And the Ukrainian armed forces do say, that there is a force of 90,000 Russian troops gathering in Zaporozhye to conduct an offensive in the oblast. Now, I haven't seen anything to confirm this yet. By the time this is up, that will probably either be proven or disproven, because that's how fast the news moves in these kind of situations. But the Ukrainians are making a point that allegedly there is going to be this major Russian offensive in the south, out of Zaporozhye, across the river, probably pushing into the city of Zaporozhye rather than just the oblast, because so far the Russians have been contained east of the river, as we've seen since at least 2023. But that's the new allegation that they're going to push through, and that they're going to. This is going to be the next major offensive on the Russian part. Now, moving further north yet again, the Russians have broken into the center of New York, or Novgorodskoye, and continue to advance towards Toretsk as well. Ukrainians have retreated from Novosilovka Pervaya. Chasov Yar does continue in a gridlock. There has been no significant advances on the Russian part, and the Ukrainians have also failed to push them back as well. So the situation is mostly stayed the same. And Volchansk is another front where it has also stalled out. Now, unlike Chasov Yar, it seems like both sides have actually lost interest in the battle in Volchansk, and that neither side is pushing forward out of a lack of interest. Whereas Chasov Yar, there certainly is a great deal of interest on the Russian side, even more so, and that they're dedicating the resources to it. It's just a hard breakthrough, and it is one of the costlier fronts for the Russians right now. And according to Julian Ropke, the famous jihadi Julian, optimism for the Ukrainian war effort is in a tailspin. Even among its biggest supporters, even among its biggest promoters, such as Julian Ropke, the Bild journalist, who spent years shilling the Syrian revolution, and of course, once that fell through, moved on to Ukraine as his new grift. He reports that the Russians move 6 kilometers per week, and that 6 villages just in the past week have also fallen, and that the Russians are becoming an unstoppable force. And even from what I've seen from him, and like I said, I think he's probably the shining example of pro-Ukraine side shills, there doesn't even seem to be any sort of call to action. This just seems like pure pessimism on this part, as if he's resigned himself to the fact that the Russians are going to continue forward with this and are going to eventually collapse the Donbass front. And I know a lot of people are saying the Donbass front is done, it's over, Ukrainian lines are imploding. I think that's sensationalist personally. The Ukrainian lines are not doing well. They are continuing to fall back. They are breaking through some encirclements in order to force a retreat, which is a very night and day example from what happened in Avdiivka, for example, where there were threats to arrest or prosecute any of the soldiers who retreated from Avdiivka. But as Ukrainian manpower, as Ukrainian resources grow thinner and thinner, they have less bargaining power. They have less even hard power to throw around when it comes to making these kind of threats, where they are starting to authorize more tactical withdrawals and allowing them to cede more land to the Russians, especially in the Donbass front. Now, the southern front, of course, they are still hell-bent on taking Crimea, at least in rhetoric. I doubt that will actually come to fruition. I don't think anyone is crazy enough to think that. But because of that, the southern front is gridlocked. And like I said, in the north, particularly about Volchansk in the Kharkov Oblast, both sides, for the time being, seem to have put that on the back burner and aren't really dedicating more troops and resources, so that front has, for the time being, frozen over. But we'll see what the next days and weeks deliver with that. There was a Russian strike on Odessa that did allegedly hit NATO forces from Britain, Spain, and France. And these were troops there that were reportedly in an advisory position to the Ukrainian forces. No NATO official nor any national official from any of the aforementioned countries have made that big of a deal out of it. None of them have raised that much of an alarm out of it. And this is far from the first time something like this would have happened in this war. I mean, the example I always go back to, because it just blows my mind, going back to the final days of Mariupol within the battle for the Azovstal plant. The Russians captured a Canadian general in May of 2022 who has not been seen since. Now, this Canadian general had all sorts of black marks on his record, so we don't know what could have happened to this man. But point being is, he was disappeared without a trace, and no real outrage was raised about it, no real protest was raised about it either at the time or even today. And getting back to the financial news, more of the broader news about Ukraine, as I had brought up before, default of the Ukrainian economy, which was slated for August of this year, so it would have been in a few weeks that the Ukrainian economy, because of the amount of debt it has taken on, was slated to default on its loans. But through some deal making, perhaps, if you want to call it that, or maybe some under the table agreements, at least the private investors in Ukraine have been convinced to take a 37% cut when it comes to loan forgiveness, that they are willing to absolve that. Originally, you had the Ukrainian government asking from anywhere from 60% to 2/3 percent forgiveness, but that was thrown out the window, and the final total negotiated from the lowball of about 20% on the investor side ended up being about 37%. Now, these being mostly Western investors, I'm sure that they have enough connections in DC, in Brussels, London, Paris, Berlin, etc., in order to make up for those losses. I'm sure that they have friends in high places who are able to ease the pain of this great financial loss for them. So this will continue because they'll receive that money. In all likelihood, I'm not saying this for certain because I don't have this concretely in front of me, but knowing what we know about the way these things work, they will receive the money. They'll receive some sort of compensation from, like I said, their special connections, which will encourage them to lend out more, and the cycle will repeat itself for the remainder of this war. And that, in my opinion, is what's likely to happen when it comes to the private investment in Ukraine. Now, rhetoric regarding peace has taken an interesting turn. Because last week, after the RNC, there was a phone call between Trump and Zelensky. You'll notice that more and more foreign leaders, more and more foreign diplomats are openly contacting Trump. For example, right now you have Bibi Netanyahu slated to visit with him. Actually, today, as of the time the show airs, because I'm recording on the 25th of July, 2024. This will be up the 26th of July, 2024. But as of both today in the recording and tomorrow, as of the date of recording, so the 25th and 26th, Trump is meeting with Netanyahu as well. And there were some interesting things leading up to that, which, like I said, I'll get into in just a moment. But, of course, Trump also had his call with Erdogan, as I had mentioned last episode. But more and more foreign governments, even the European ones who are firmly aligned with the American empire, firmly aligned with the current powers that be in Washington, have seemingly made peace with the idea of Trump being in power. And I think it might be a refreshing change for some of them, because despite their disillusionment with Trump, it is a return to something they're familiar with versus the very opaque nature of, especially the past few months of the Biden administration. Since the beginning of this year, Biden administration has been more opaque than ever, in which case that only gets worse the more we get into this episode. Whereas Trump, he was a pain to deal with. He was bad optics, especially at times for them. But at this point, he's a known quantity. They know what they'll get from him, versus the complete layers of secrecy, even beyond what just you would expect from any government, that the current administration is operating with, which is, I can't say at least in my lifetime, because I don't have that long of a memory span to judge off of. But from what I know about, let's just say, 20th century American history onward, it's unprecedented. A lot of what's happening right now is unprecedented, but I don't want to get into this early in the show. Moving back to that, after Trump and Zelensky had their little phone call, the tune out of Kiev changes markedly. You have Zelensky more amenable to the ideas of peace. Now, he said that Trump's peace plan was a no-go because it would require the cession of Ukrainian territories, which he was not willing to accept. At which point, I don't actually believe Zelensky on this one. I know that they have taken a very hard line when it has come to negotiating with Russia since the start of this war, and that even now they have constitutional restrictions that would forbid them from negotiating with Russia in the event of Putin still being in power, that Putin would have to depart from office before negotiations could begin. And like I said, that's constitutionally bound, but I have a feeling the Constitution of Ukraine doesn't carry much legal weight within the country when it comes to the way things are actually done. But what is arguably more interesting than Zelensky's bloviating about a peace agreement is Kuleba's actions. Now, Kuleba is in China right now, meeting with Xi Jinping and other high ranking officials, discussing a path to peace. Now, previously in 2023, China has presented itself as a mediator in the war in Ukraine because China has remained very neutral. Now, their economic relationship with Russia has greatly expanded. It has multiplied greatly beyond, I think, really what anyone was expecting. Some people were speculating at the beginning of this war that China would find some way to go along with the sanctions regime. Now, that being said, China is still an integral part of the supply chain in the West, including for military equipment and even explosives as well. So, you can't exactly say China's playing both sides of this, but they do have, even in a roundabout way, their ways of staying on good terms with the West in all of this. And Kuleba went to China and expressed interest in an actual peace summit rather than what we've seen before. And with all that being said, he even so you have the Ukrainians, you have Kuleba, the foreign minister of Ukraine right now, right under Zelensky, who goes to China and affirms the one China policy. Does not recognize Taiwan as a state. Says part of China that the status quo should remain, which is the current position of the Chinese government. Now, that's also the official position of the United States. However, we continue to invest more in Taiwan. We continue to sign more arms deals with Taiwan, in which case we effectively do not believe that. Now, who knows what the Ukrainians would do, but it does show an interesting departure from even the strongest of U.S. vassals on the issue of Ukraine, on the issue of Taiwan as well. I had a Joe Biden moment there. Don't impeach me, please. I enjoy doing this program, but I'm getting off topic with that. And then the other big news out of Ukraine before I get into the interview that Siersky gave to The Guardian, I'm going to read through and comment on that in just a few moments here, is that conscription dodging does continue. The most recent reports is along the zone of the Moldova-Ukraine border, there are several abandoned vehicles where men will abandon their vehicles and try to cross on foot, particularly because, of course, there is crossing of water and other treacherous terrain in order to actually get into Ukraine. Dozens of men have been detained just within the past several weeks trying to get across the border, and there are talks in Moldova of extraditing these men back to Ukraine. And I do think it's twofold. I think first and foremost, Moldova is under the control of a color revolution government. So, of course, they're going to send the cannon fodder back to Ukraine. Number two, Moldova is also a tiny nation in Europe, one of the poorest in Europe, and can't bear that much of an influx of new arrivals. So, I think it's far more the first than the second in that regard because, like I said, Moldova has been completely subsumed by a color revolution government, and even more so than, say, some of these other countries in Central or Eastern Europe, and is especially cooperative because even stalwart supporters of Ukraine like Poland have their moments of resistance and pushback, which I'll get into some of the news about what has happened between Poland and Ukraine just in the past couple days. And the other big piece of news out of Ukraine is that there have been anti-conscription demonstrations in both Kiev and Odessa, as well as other cities across the country, that the press for more manpower is grating on Ukraine's population, and that The people are exhausted. As I'd covered last episode, a plurality are ready for some sort of negotiation. And also, I think at this point, there's about one-third of the population that openly admits they'd be willing to cede some territory if it means an end to the fighting. But moving on from all of that, we have this Guardian interview with Syrsky, commander of the Ukrainian Armed Forces. And I'll just flip over to this and we'll read it together. So, I know we will win. And how? Ukraine's top general on turning the tables against Russia. Exclusive. Colonel Alexander Syrsky weighs Ukraine's recent setbacks, counterstrikes, and the changing face of Europe's biggest war since 1945. And you can see right here in this picture, he is emulating his hero right now. He's emulating his boss. Has the Zelensky t-shirt on right now. So we'll continue. As of July 24th, 2024. Sitting on a stack of ammunition crates at a secret military base, Colonel General Alexander Syrsky was tight-lipped about when Ukraine will receive a long-awaited delivery of F-16s. The Dutch and other allies have said they will arrive soon, this week or maybe August. I know, but I can't tell you. Unfortunately, he said with an apologetic grin as gulls squawked nearby. Syrsky is Ukraine's new commander-in-chief. His unenviable task is to defeat a bigger Russian army 2.5 years into the Vladimir Putin's full-scale onslaught. He acknowledges the Russians are much better resourced. They have more of everything: tanks, infantry, fighting vehicles, soldiers, etc. Their original 100,000-man strong invasion force has grown to 520,000, he said, with the goal of 690,000 by the end of 2024. The figures of Ukraine have not been made public. When it comes to equipment, there's a ratio of 1 to 2 or 1 to 3 in their favor. He said, since 2022, the number of Russian tanks have doubled from 1,700 to 3,500. Artillery systems have tripled, and armored personnel carriers have gone from 4,500 to 8,900. Quote, the enemy has a significant advantage in force and resources, Syrsky said. Therefore, for us, the issue of supply, the issue of quality, is really at the forefront. The man and machine superiority that explains the recent events in the battlefield. Since last autumn, Ukraine's armed forces have been going steadily backwards. One of his first acts when he got to the job in February 2024, replacing Valery Zaluzhny, now Ukraine's ambassador to the UK, was to order the withdrawal of troops from the eastern city of Avdiivka. The retreat coincided with a 6-month gap in U.S. supply of weapons. More have recently arrived. The Russians, however, are still seizing fields and villages in eastern Donbass, using airdrop bombs to blast the path forward. They have gobbled up territory northwest of Avdiivka towards the garrison of Pokrovsk and the besieged hilltop settlement of Chasiv Yar. In May, Russian forces opened a new front in the Kharkov Oblast, Kharkov region, storming the city of Volchansk. Ukraine anticipated this attack, seemingly couldn't stop it. In an exclusive interview with The Guardian, his first foreign newspaper as overall military chief, Syrsky admitted that things were very difficult. And I would say that's certainly an understatement on his part. And some of the statements he does make later on here do get more interesting. I think you can read into them if you want to, and I do think there is cause to read into them, but I'll continue. The Russian aggressor attacks our position in many directions, he said. Could Russia's advance be halted? Yes, of course. First of all, it depends on our brave soldiers, our officers, he said, quite frequently resilient and heroic. Ukrainian units defeated bigger enemy groups, he said. By the way of example, he said Russia's latest attempt to seize Kharkov and the neighboring province of Sumy, it failed, Syrsky said. Fighting continued, but he said Putin's attempt to create a so-called security corridor next to Russia's border and the Belgorod region has been thwarted. What about rumors that Moscow is planning another assault in southern Zaporozhye region? If it happens, we can quote-unquote give them a good response, he replies. Now, I will say that when it came to the alleged offensives on Kharkov and Sumy, I wouldn't say that it was so much a success of the Ukrainian armed forces, the fact that it didn't proceed forward. But of course, that was once again in Russia's initiative, as have pretty much everything in this war has been of Russia's initiative since the failure of the counteroffensive. That Ukraine has been the reactive party, whereas Russia has been the proactive party on the front lines in this war. So, of course, he colors this in a certain light, as one would expect him to. But to continue on, overall, Siersky sought to put recent setbacks in context. He described Russia's creeping victories as tactical ones, local gains rather than any operational breakthroughs, such as the capture of a major city. In principle, the enemy has not made any significant progress. The front line, he added, was 3,700 kilometers long. Active hostilities were taking place across 977 kilometers, or twice the length of the border of Germany and France. Russia's successes, meanwhile, came at a staggering human cost. The Kremlin casualties were allegedly 3 times higher than Ukraine's, and even more in a certain direction, Siersky said. The numbers of those killed is much bigger, he emphasized. In February, Volodymyr Zelensky said 31,000 Ukrainian service personnel have died since 2022. Could Siersky update this figure? He declined, saying losses were sensitive and a topic Moscow could exploit. Now, it is interesting that he actually came out and said that, because that does seem like the first amount of, let's just say, operational security on the part of the Ukrainians that Siersky wasn't willing to come out and just blurt these figures. As for the 3 times as many losses, number one, Russia is conducting offensives in this war. It is on the attack, and typically attackers take higher casualties. Number two, the manpower they have to spare is far higher than that of the Ukrainians. So when it comes to how much Russia can afford to lose versus how much Ukraine can afford to lose, 3 to 1, especially for a defensive power, isn't the accomplishment I think he would like to tout. And of course he knows that, and he's playing to the foreign media. And we all know the reason. We all know the point of these kind of articles. This isn't any sort of truth coming out there and being told. And this is, I don't want to call this bloviation because there's a bit more substance. For example, an interview with somebody like Zelensky would be bloviation. But this has a bit more substance. But of course, he's trying to paint a narrative, as everyone does. But it should be very clear here. Siersky contrasts his battlefield tactics with those used by the Russian commanders, who are known for sacrificing huge numbers of infantry troops to gain 100 to 200 meters. It is very important for us to save the lives of our soldiers. We don't defend ruins to the death, Siersky said. He said he was not willing to achieve goals at any cost, or to chuck his men into futile meat assaults. The Butcher of Bakhmut is telling us about futile meat assaults. That's an interesting one. Sometimes it was necessary to move to quote-unquote more favorable positions. And once again, the Russians, especially compared to wars they've fought in just even the recent past, have been rather casualty averse in this conflict, and that they have, in many ways, been very cautious of this conflict, and some might even say overly cautious with this conflict. Amid skepticism about Ukraine's prospect of achieving outright victory, Siersky noted that the possible developments of F-16s would strengthen Ukraine's air defenses. They would allow Kiev to work more efficiently against Russian cruise missiles and to hit ground targets accurately. However, there were limits to what F-16s might be able to achieve, he stressed. They would have to remain 40 kilometers more from the front line because of the risk that Moscow would shoot them down. Which brings us back to the idea that the F-16s would be stationed in NATO countries. They would land in Ukraine for armament, and then they would enter into sortie in the combat zone. Which was incoherent, was never going to happen, and that plan has been, pardon the pun, or I suppose no pun intended in this case, shot down. Russia has superior aviation and very strong air defenses. Because of this, Ukraine was increasingly turning to unmanned aerial systems, Siersky said. It used drones very effectively and was trying to out robotic ground systems, land robots that could deliver ammunition or rescue a wounded soldier. There were new unmanned systems command, the first of its kind. We fight not by quantity but by quality, adding that drones played as big a role as artillery. Which, especially for the Ukrainian side, I can believe that drones have been, I'm far from the first one to say this, have been just absolutely pivotal in this war. Ukraine's armed forces were successfully using long-range kamikaze drones to strike deep inside Russia, he said. So far, they had targeted about 200 critical infrastructure sites. All were connected to quote-unquote military logistics, which included factories, fuel dumps, munitions depots. Speedboat-like sea drones, meanwhile, have sunk about a third of the Russian Black Sea naval fleet. I have a hard time believing that one, even with the inflated figures. I understand some of these, pretty much all of these, are going to be skewed, but I would have expected a more believable lie out of Siersky's mouth, actually, not just outright saying 1/3. Now, I'm willing to be proven wrong. If somebody has more concrete details on that, please do send them my way. But that I severely doubt it. I'll just leave it there. It became a trap for some of them, and for some vessels, a grave. Siersky said. The Kremlin added he was forced to completely pull out from the Crimean port of Sevastopol after a series of Ukrainian attacks. Now, that I do believe that the Russians would have taken their fleets to a more defensive position. Crimea has been under a number of strikes. It's probably been out of everywhere the Russians control right now. Crimea has probably been one of the primary targets from the Ukrainians. Drone and missile strikes have wiped out radar and rocket installations. A key Ukrainian objective was to destroy the Kerch road and rail crossing connecting the occupied peninsula with Russia. Siersky declined to say what might happen. Two earlier attempts featured a truck bomb and a drone strike, of course, both of which failed. He said that Kiev has a plan to get back Crimea more than a decade after Vladimir Putin illegally annexed it. Was this really feasible? It's realistic. Of course, it's a big military secret, the general said. He continued, we will do everything we can to reach the internationally recognized borders in 1991 when Ukraine voted for its independence from the USSR. We have to win to liberate our citizens who are in the occupied territories suffering. Now, of course, I don't believe that they have a concrete plan to get Crimea back. That's just what the Western backers want to hear. Of course, Crimea is the grand prize of Ukraine. The reason why the Maidan happened in the first place, even why the Orange Revolution going all the way back to '04 happened in the first place. Crimea has always been the prize of Black Sea ports, and NATO wanted them. And NATO was deprived of them, even after the color revolution in Ukraine, because Russia acted, and there was the annexation of Crimea. And, like I said, while I don't believe that Siersky has any real plan to get back Crimea, it's an obligatory thing to say. He has to hammer that point home that I can get you Crimea. I can be the man who makes all of your dreams come true, so to speak. Age 58, Siersky was born in Vladimir, which is a city outside of Moscow, which was then the Soviet Union. Once again, he was born inside territorial Russia, is an ethnic Russian, is estranged from his family still living in Russia. So, all very interesting things to note about this man. The only reason he's in Ukraine right now, and we'll get into this, is because he couldn't make it in Russia in terms of an armed forces career. So since the 1990s, he has served in Ukraine's armed forces. Critics accuse him of Soviet military thinking. Supporters describe him as disciplined and talented commander who, in contrast to his charismatic predecessor Zaluzhny, is often on the front lines. In February 2022, as head of ground forces, he led the defense of Kiev. Zelensky made him a hero of Ukraine and 6 months ago promoted him to be commander-in-chief. Close up, Siersky is warm and personal. His handshake is suitably iron. Meeting Siersky involved cloak and dagger arrangements and a serious blah blah blah. Like, it. Just article filler right here. Like many serving soldiers, he sees his family very rarely. They suffer without me, so maybe it's a big issue for them too, but I know that we will win. I know how to do it, and I'm sure that we will do it. The general says he doesn't sleep very many hours. In rare moments off, he reads books on Ukrainian history in order to stand past processes. I wonder if he's ever read about Khmelnytsky and his swearing of fealty to the Russian Tsar in Moscow. I wonder if he's read that history. I wonder if he's read any real history of Ukraine that isn't just post 1991 talking points. Who knows? I would be interested to see what his perspective is here. And like I said, he's not even ethnically Ukrainian by virtue of having been from eastern Ukraine. Not even an ethnic Russian who sees himself as Ukrainian. No, born inside the Soviet Union, but inside Russian territory of the Soviet Union, outside of Moscow. So you have to doubt his claims of identity when it comes to these sort of things, but I'm getting sidetracked here. One of Siersky's most pressing challenges is to find new recruits to replace Ukrainian soldiers who have been killed and injured. Those fighting in the trenches are exhausted. The patriotic fervor that led many in spring 2022 to volunteers worn off. And many of those first volunteers were wasted in PR stunts, frankly. They were the ones who were sent off, as I discussed at the beginning of the show, and I will once again recommend the History Legends video on it that he just put out. They were wasted on things like Krinky. They were wasted on these efforts that were going to accomplish nothing in terms of the way the war effort actually turned out, except to secure the support of Western backers. These men who probably would have fought, who did fight into the end, and had they lived longer, probably would have fought in much more bitter conditions than they did. They expended those troops early on in the war, and they are left with the men that they have to press in the surface after throwing into vans. Which we've seen the morale they have, we see the performance they put up on the front lines. And it's no good. I can't blame them. These men are undertrained, they're under-equipped, they have no business on the front lines, and many of them are fighting for a country, and you listen to some things that come out of Kiev and even more westward of Kiev, a country that has nothing but disdain for them. But to continue, the government recently reduced the conscription age from 27 to 25. Last week, a new law came into effect requiring men to register their details with military recruitment centers. Many have done so, others are hiding. Siersky said that without mobilization, he could not create a new reserve and brigades. Now, I believe it was actually right before he assumed position of commander of the armed forces that he was calling for 500,000 more men in order to accomplish his goals on the front. So, this is his views on conscription. He couldn't care less. He would conscript 18-year-olds if he could. And frankly, probably younger. I think if put in this position, maybe I'm assuming too much about Siersky. If he could convince the Ukrainian population and the Western backers to support conscription from ages 16 to 55, I think he would. And you already see it right now. The average age on the front line gets older and older. At this point, I think it's like 42, 43 on the front lines. Now, bear with me, people. We are in the home stretch of this. Siersky said, without mobilization, he could not create new reserves and new brigades, blah, 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 which were needed to, as Russia multiplied its own land forces. It's very important for us that all Ukrainian citizens fulfill their constitutional duty, he said. He urged Ukrainians living outside the country to take part as well. I hope after victory they will be able to tell their children where they were. Where were you when all citizens of Ukraine were fighting in such fierce battles? That is the question. Very cheap appeal to patriotism, nationalism, like I said, for a nation that in many cases has nothing but disdain for them, but I digress. One initiative is taking place in neighboring Poland. Ukrainians abroad will soon be invited to join a new legion there. Oh yes, the Ukrainian, Polish, Lithuanian Legion. I'm sure they will emulate great historical successes, that it will really be a reunification of the Commonwealth, and that all these groups who coexisted very peacefully the first time around will find a way to coexist peacefully once more. Training will take place in Poland itself, building trust between men and officers. Later, the Legion will transfer to the front lines. Siersky credited Zelensky with the different approach. One sense relations between them are harmonious, helped perhaps by the fact that Commander has zero political ambitions and a lower profile than Zelensky. Siersky is celebrated in a cat meme, though. I need to see this. Hold on, let me pull this up on a different tab. We'll be right back. Oh, look, it's a fluff piece. One of the cats the Ukrainians found on the front line that entered Siersky. I mean, cute cat. It's a shame he has such a stupid name, though. But I digress. Moving on, back to the article. Russia began its armed takeover of Ukraine in 2014 when it covertly grabbed parts of Donetsk region. More than a decade on, there seems little likelihood that Europe's biggest war since 1945 will finish this year or next. Donald Trump's pledge to end the war in one day notwithstanding. Could Ukraine win? And if so, how long before victory? I think you have to be very brave to say when. We do everything to make it happen. There is simply no more important task, Siersky says, leaving the stage and striding back to more important work. So my ultimate take here, Sierski was trying to regain the confidence of the public, especially the Western public, by putting out this piece right here. When, at least the way I read it, now perhaps I'm being too uncharitable here, was saying Ukraine is SOL. There's nothing we can do at this point, and it's just a matter of putting off the inevitable and resisting as much as we can in order to secure a better position for any potential negotiations. But Sierski went out there, put out this fluff piece, this morale. Frankly, I think that cat named Sierski would probably be a better and frankly more compassionate commander than the man himself. But I digress. We have a bit more to move on to with some news out of Europe that I will return to right here. And starting out of the UK with the new Labour government, according to Bloomberg magazine, that is, Dahmer told Maloney that migration was a tough talk on his part, and that he signaled he would remain tough on crime, migration, and centre left on the economy to avoid giving fuel to the fire when it comes to Tories and Reform parties and other right-wing parties, and meeting the fate of Macron, Biden, and Schloss. Uh, I I find it very funny that he included throwing Schloss under the bus there because Schloss did announce this week that he is seeking re-election in 2025 to remain in the position of chancellor. So, I mean, Macron and Biden, it makes sense. They're both in a lame duck term here, and like I said, we'll explain more about Biden right there. But that is an interesting admission on his part, if we're to believe everything that Bloomberg says right here, because it does show in the UK they're willing to make some concessions, that they're willing to return to a modicum of order and stability in order to stave off the right. And this isn't the first place that has done it on the continent or in Europe in general, because Denmark, notably with its left-wing party, it was an election a few years back. I can't remember what year. They took the right-wing position on immigration and actually largely stuck to it, and were able to maintain the center-left in the country because of that. And I don't know if this will become a bigger trend. I know that Macron briefly hinted at that before completely reversing course and doing the exact opposite, really. But I do have to wonder as the situation continues with that. And you saw some of this in the U.S., the quote-unquote border bill, which was still atrocious. So it just still did not address the issue by any means. But there was some overtures to the idea that they needed to moderate on the issue. And we'll see how much Stammer actually does moderate on the issue of migration, if there actually is a real crackdown, in which case credit where credit is due. I think that, frankly, the British people are going to take help from wherever they can get it, even if it is from, let's just say, a less than desirable government. And like I said, I have no doubt that if need be, a lot of these countries, a lot of these political parties are willing to concede in the short term on some of these issues in order to pursue their longer term goals. The ones, let's just say, with some more foresight. Of course, there's some that just have no foresight, are just completely sold into their own narrative and will continue regardless of what comes up. And we do see that. But to continue on with other news out of Western Europe, Macron does put off government formation until, he says, mid-August. He wants to get through the Olympics first. He wants France to have its big PR moment. I mean, and that's already off to a terrible start. And by the time this premieres, the Paris hosting of the Olympics will have began already. I am curious. I know that they've become a spectacle, a parody of them for themselves. But I am curious to see how they pull this off, if this actually does turn out to be a stable event that brings some publicity to Paris, or if we're going to get more of what's happening right now, which is violence in the street, just petty crime, escalating to violent crime against people who are in town visiting as tourists in order to see the game. So we'll see if this disorder is quelled, but Macron is, for whatever reason, staking his public image on these going off without a hitch. But even then, he couldn't stop this. And, I mean, PR stunts like this happen all the time. but he couldn't even clean up crime long enough for this to look good on his part. Now, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe throughout the duration of the actual events, because they haven't started yet, that there will be a marked police presence in Paris and that crime will go down temporarily and that they will be much harsher in enforcing the law there. But that remains to be seen. However, Macron is just using this excuse to put off governing, especially as efforts to form a coalition in the parliament after the election, after the snap election that was called last month, have failed. So I guess we'll return to the issue in mid-August when the French decide to form a government and the parliament decides to get back into session and solve these issues. And our last piece of news out of Western Europe is that Western arms shipments to Ukraine have ended up on the black market and notably have made their way to Italy to organized crime outfits like the Camorra in Naples and, of course, the Sicilian Mafia, and also the organized crime outfits of Calabria and just across southern Italy, where their activities have waned and waxed over the years. I do believe that it is in a current uptick right now with some of the organized crime activities, and there's some who facilitate the migration, who work in human trafficking in that regard, some who view it as a threat to the bottom line. So it is interesting dynamics over there, but I I do have to report that many of the Western arms shipments have made their way into criminal hands in Italy, and that has actually caused some pause on the part of the Meloni government, who, mind you, the Meloni government have been steadfast supporters of Ukraine since they took office in late 2022. But getting into the more interesting news about Europe is the current energy disputes involving the countries of, I guess one could call Central Europe and Ukraine. Now, particularly Hungary and Slovakia have been conciliatory towards Russia in this war, as conciliatory as a European country can be. Orban going as far as to visit Russia and also visit Ukraine as well in order to lay the groundwork for the peace process. And while Orban saw little progress with Zelensky, he saw much more progress when he went to Russia with his peace plan and with his later visit to China, trying to bring them in on the peace process, and even reportedly with his visits with Donald Trump as well after the NATO summit back earlier in the month. And now, as a response to this, Ukraine is cutting off the oil supplied through the Druzhba pipeline, the friendship pipeline, to both Ukraine and Slovakia. And I don't believe Druzhba goes through Poland, but I know that Poland has been affected by Ukrainian energy antics before, as well as the outstanding issue with grain shipments when it comes to grain shipments into Europe that threaten the bottom line of many European farmers. And now you have a sharp increase in energy prices in both Hungary and Slovakia. In many ways, I do believe that this is Brussels doing. They're trying to create an energy crisis in Europe because Hungary was originally given an exemption for the sanctions when it came to Russian energy, and that they didn't partake in that part of the sanctions package. And as a result of that, they've become more defiant with the European Union, and the European Union, frankly, probably leaned on leaned on Ukraine to cut off oil supplies to Hungary. Now, this has potential unintended consequence, severe unintended consequence for Ukraine. So, first, Hungary and Slovakia went to the EU Commission. They tried to appeal this the quote-unquote proper way, go through the proper channels. And when that failed, they started playing hardball on their own. At this point, because of the war, because of the damage done, as Joseph Borrell reports, 70% of Ukrainian energy production capabilities have been destroyed as a result of the war. Hungary, Slovakia, and even Poland at this point have threatened to cut off Ukraine from their energy grid because they have been selling their excess energy to Ukraine in order to keep the lights on there. Now, Romania is another country that does that, but there is no word that Romania has any intent in partaking in this effort. But the hardball that Hungary is playing right now is more or less threatening to shut off the Ukrainian power grid. And you already are having blackouts throughout Ukraine. You're already having energy infrastructure problems. As Borrell had said, 70% of Ukrainian energy infrastructure has been destroyed at this point. And there's also that which has been damaged and that which is just no longer in effect. I mean, for example, we look at some of the power plants, especially in the east. The Zaporozhye power plant has been under control of the Russians for about 2 years now. So they've been deprived from that. The Russians have the ability to shut that on and off. And throughout the country, energy shortages have become one of the most severe crises, along with manpower and, I mean, and the economic issues. Those are the three major issues facing Ukraine right now. And this is a battle that they cannot win unless the EU has some trick up their sleeve to penalize these countries for shutting off the power grid to Ukraine. But it does make me question if these are deals between these individual countries and Ukraine. What say would the EU have over it? Now, perhaps you could say the EU invests in their power grids. That maybe, for example, Germany has partial ownership over these power grids, etc., etc. I'm actually not quite sure of that myself. If there's any recourse that Brussels could employ in favor of Ukraine in order to pressure the Hungarians and pressure the Slovaks and pressure the Poles into turning the power back on. I would imagine if Ukraine is brazen enough to threaten to cut off the Druzhba pipeline, that they would expect some sort of latent support from Brussels in this endeavor. Now, I could be wrong. This could just be complete brazenness on their part. But the way I see it right now is that they do. They're playing a game that I think is really far beyond their capability at this point. And I don't know what the ultimate goal here is. This is some sort of hardball negotiating tactic. But like I said, it seems like in these negotiating tactics, if they're really concerned about Hungary and Slovakia dragging their feet with aid, that they have a lot more leverage to pull on Ukraine than vice versa. And in the end, of course, it's not Zelensky who loses power. It's not the elite in Kiev who lose power. It's probably not even the people in Lviv or certain parts of Odessa losing power. It's the everyday Ukrainians, the same ones who are being thrown in the back of vans and shipped off the front line without proper training. So what could they care? But you do have to wonder how much more is the Ukrainian population willing to tolerate, because the Ukrainian population is under complete siege right now. And even beyond that, from the Russian forces, which are an enemy combatant in their country, which I once again you can discuss the intricacies of the Russian invasion, where they right to go and whatever. That's not the point. But the point being is their own state is just as bad, if not worse, than the enemy combatants within their borders. And we've seen this time and time again. And we keep seeing this over and over again, where the Ukrainian state has a propensity for making enemies of its own people. And I have to wonder how much longer is this going to continue? How much of a grasp do certain political factions actually have over the country if they're able to enforce these kind of measures? But I doubt we'll see a complete shutoff of the Ukrainian energy grid, but it is a hardball tactic that they're willing to play. It is fire that they're willing to play with, that the Hungarians and Slovaks and Poles just flip the switch one day, which they very well can, to my understanding. And like I said, maybe there's some details I'm missing right here. But moving on, the EU has finally moved to strip Hungary of its voting power in foreign policy issues. Now, we'll see if this actually holds, if this actually goes through, and if Hungary, which holds the presidency of the European Union Council, is actually stripped from foreign policy decisions. And of course, they used Orban's visits to Russia, and to a lesser extent China, as justification for that. So, we'll see what really comes of the EU's more brazen moves. But what I can tell you about the EU for certain is that Borrell has come out and told us that the first wave of frozen Russian assets, which is worth about 1.4 billion euro, have been transferred to the European Commission, and they will be available the first week of August. And of course, that frees up the funds in order to send to Ukraine. Or who knows, maybe the EU will embezzle them for themselves and leave Ukraine out to dry. But this was a long time coming. I think the Russians have probably written off these assets a long time ago. I don't think that they ever expected to get these back. This was something that they accounted for most likely when they had started this war and realized that severe sanctions package would be put in place. So it's not going to be that much of a blow to the Russian economy in that regard, but the potential that it frees up yet more money to send to Ukraine does present an issue if that can be used to actually secure armaments. And who knows, maybe it's too little too late at this point for the Ukrainians in that regard because the war effort has soured so much. And I mean, I personally, from my analysis of the conflict, I would need to see more solid manpower numbers and more solid equipment numbers, and also ways to procure this equipment. I know, once again, one of the big negotiations going on was the Czech Republic trying to get 800,000 artillery shells to Ukraine from various sources, particularly from Africa and the Middle East, buying stockpiles from there. But money only goes so far when there's a limited supply of what you can buy. And the last piece of news I have out of Europe, which I think warrants any sort of coverage, is that Poland has announced that they would not accept the candidacy of Ukraine as a European Union member if they did not come out and denounce the Volyn massacre from World War II. Now, for those of you unfamiliar, which I'm sure most of you are, but just to reiterate, it took place in 1943 when Ukrainian nationalists, particularly the wing associated with Bandera, committed massacres in Volyn, which was part of Poland up until World War II. The borders had been drawn out of the treaties in 1919 awarded Volyn, which had an ethnically mixed population of Poles, Ukrainians, and East Slavs, I should say, because it goes back even further. You go back even to the 16th, 17th century, and also a large Jewish population. And in 1943, there were massacres of the Polish and the Jewish populations in particular, as well as a small amount of ethnic Russians, as well as others that could be found there. More or less anyone who didn't align with the Ukrainian nationalist was subject to slaughter. So Poland has said until they get an official condemnation of that, they're not going to stand down. And like many of these tragedies, like many of these historical atrocities, they are played for political reasons. And I'm sure there's people, especially considering the fact that is within living memory, who were either affected by it primarily or secondarily, whether, I mean, at this point they would have been very young children had they lived through that, or had they known anyone who was a victim of it. But much like we see with, for example, the Holodomor in Ukraine, or the certain big one with Israel and its diaspora population, these things are played for political gain. These things are played for political points in order to extract a concession from a foreign state out of a sense of guilt or the mending of bridges, the burying of the hatchet, if you will. And on top of that, Poland has actually built a monument to the victims of the Volyn massacre that has a very interesting imagery. I don't want to show it on stream in case YouTube gets touchy about something like that, but it is a pitchfork with a person on it. And that pitchfork bears a striking resemblance to the trident in the Ukrainian coat of arms. In which case, it is, in my opinion, what looks like a blatant call out towards Ukraine. That they are demanding an apology, that they are demanding some sort of recognition and reconciliation of this. Mind you, even the Russian Federation, going all the way back to 2007, issued official apologies for the massacres in Katyn, wherein the Soviet forces massacred, I think it was upwards of 20,000 Polish officers after the Soviet invasion. So even back then, when Russia was making its overtures towards the West, they tried to mend that bridge. But the Ukrainians have not said a thing about Volyn. Even back when they weren't a completely, quote-unquote, pro-Western country. So it will be interesting to see if this rift does continue to grow between Poland and Ukraine, because they have been. Ukraine has been a. Poland, excuse me, has been a steadfast supporter of Ukraine, mostly in an enemy of my enemy sense. Because you look at this, of course, they're anti Russia. They want to see the Russians knocked down a peg, so they're willing to support the Ukrainians in order to accomplish that goal. But when it comes to virtually every other issue, they are at the very least competitors, whether that comes to economic issues, as I had discussed the grain issue, when it comes to issues regarding migration, especially the recent waves of migration that have showed up in Poland since the start of the war, which do include a lot of military-aged men. And like I said before, I support every military-aged man getting out of Ukraine, even just for bringing this conflict to a faster close, because Ukraine doesn't have any more men to conscript, because they're all out of the country. But there has been issues with migrants in Poland. There's been economic issues. There's been security issues that where Poland, although they have saber rattled against Russia for a number of years now, since the escalation of tensions in 2014, they've never really committed to it, say, in the same way the Baltic states have. And what's actually interesting is you could make the argument, well, I'm sure there's many in Poland, a lot of people in Poland, and also within the Polish government itself, who do want to send arms to Ukraine to get one over on Russia. You do have to remember, a large part of the Polish agreements to arm shipments towards Ukraine was done under the assumption that they would receive superior Western replacements, either from the United States or Germany. With the negotiations when Poland was clearing out its fleet of Soviet-era tanks, sending them to Ukraine, they were trying to negotiate a one-for-one deal where they would be compensated from Germany, from Western countries, with current generation tanks, where the Western countries argued, because they parted ways with older Soviet stockpiles, that they should only receive one replacement for every 3 tanks given, and that was a big dispute for a while, especially when it came to arms shipments. So there was certainly a large degree of self-interest as far as Poland was concerned when it came to the armament of Ukraine, where a lot of these other countries, especially I think Romania is one of the other example, forked over the aid with little in return being expected. So I will be greatly interested to see if this rift does continue. I know that the joke on the Russian side has always been, well, maybe we can patch things up with Poland if we win the war in Ukraine and then give Lvov and Volyn back to Poland. And who knows, maybe that is in the cards. And I know that there was some speculation that next week, for some of the western parts of Ukraine, would be put under some sort of de facto NATO occupation in order to bring them within the security umbrella. But I don't think that's going to happen. I don't think Romania's getting Bukovina back. I don't think Poland's getting Lvov back. I don't think Hungary's getting Transcarpathia back, unfortunately. But frankly, I do think it would make for a much more stable situation if a lot of the, like I said, western extremities of Ukraine were reattached to nations that they were historically part of. And that might be a way to diffuse tensions while appeasing NATO. We can ultimately see how this peace deal works out if Donald Trump gets back in and we get the big package of peace that he promised. But moving on to some news out of the Middle East, I do want to cover some recent stuff from Israel, particularly Netanyahu's address to Congress, before I get into the meat and potatoes of U.S. news here. So, in brief, over the past week, Israeli troops launched artillery strikes and airstrikes against the Gaza Strip, reporting damage to Hamas. The southern part was under the most intensive fire. In the south of the enclave, the IDF press service announced that there was an evacuation of residents from a large area of Khan Yunis, including parts of the humanitarian zone. Throughout the day, there were reports of the start of an Israeli ground offensive, but depths of this advance are still undetermined. In the West Bank, Israeli security forces carried out several operations reporting the detention of Hamas associates. A series of arrests took place in Azun, and there were clashes in Ramallah. And on the border with Lebanon, there was exchange of strikes between Hezbollah and the IDF, with Hezbollah publishing threats against Israel and also announcing that defeat announcing the defeat of several IDF targets. In turn, Israeli troops worked through southern Lebanon. And just following up on the drone attack that took place in it last week, in the latter end of last week. So several hours before the Houthi drone attack on Tel Aviv, the commander of the U.S. Central Command, General Mike E. Kurilla, who had wrapped up a trip to Israel where he met with Israeli intelligence and military officials, had penned a letter to Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin in which he states the campaign against the Houthis has been a clear failure due to unwillingness by officials to commit to the operation because of escalation fears. Kurilla further stated that in the letter that if this were allowed to continue, American service members will die. So, like I said, that was in the lead up to the drone strikes near the U.S. Embassy in Tel Aviv, which, once again, despite the capital having been moved to Jerusalem, it does seem like a lot of our official diplomatic efforts are still conducted out of Tel Aviv, as one would realistically expect. So I guess that's one big accomplishment, one big victory for the Israeli lobby that never really came to fruition. But in a much more simpering fashion this week, we had Netanyahu's speech to Congress, which was, where do I even begin? For starters, he received anywhere I've seen reports from 50 to 70 standing ovations in his fourth address to the U.S. Congress. Beforehand, Speaker Mike Johnson had announced that any disruption of the event would result in the arrest of audience members. And you had several members of Congress who boycotted the speech on both sides of the aisle, actually. Now, you can chalk some of these up to unavailability, other duties of the office were in their home, in their constituencies, etc., etc. So the idea that all 535 members of Congress being there was never going to happen, and of course there were special guests invited, Elon Musk unfortunately being among them. And Netanyahu gave up there and gave the same bloviation he always did. He started by recounting October 7th and talking about how bad it was. Said it was the equivalent of 29/11s, and that was his big opener. He said that the people protesting Israel are wrong because they don't understand that Israel is so much morally superior. Blah 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 blah. A lot of the, like I said, grandstanding. Gave praise to Biden in the speech. Said I want to thank Biden for his unwavering support of Israel. Blah blah blah. But when it came to the actual substance of the speech, the most important part, in my opinion, in terms of what actually matters, is when he pitched the Abraham Alliance, an alliance of the United States providing a security umbrella to Israel, Arab nations willing to work with Israel against Iran. He even said it would be like a Middle Eastern NATO. That is the pitch that he gave to it. And this is the groundwork that we did see in Trump's last days in office with the Abraham Accords, hence the name of the Abraham Alliance, where Trump did get concessions from a few Arab states to go out and officially recognize Israel, as well as laying the pathwork for peace between, say, the Gulf states and Israel, and formalizing the backdoor relations that they've had for a number of years now. And as public opinion pivots towards the idea of Trump being the nominee, we do see the revival of ideas like this. And afterwards, Netanyahu, after his speech, in which, like I said, his biggest proposal was the Abraham Alliance, and also going as far as to say it was an Iranian intelligence op what happened to Trump on July 13th, and that he has some sort of damning evidence that would prove it was the Iranians, so we have to act now before the Iranians go any further. Israel, of course, is the first and only line of defense that the entire Western world has against Iran, that we owe them our complete loyalty and fealty. Well, like I said, the self-aggrandizing speech that he always gives, but beyond the proposal of the Abraham Alliance and the speculation about Trump. Now, it is noteworthy that neither Kamala Harris nor Joe Biden had attended the speech. And like I said, they were among the ones who did not show up. There were some who made their boycott more publicly known, but like I said, because of the strange situation surrounding the Biden campaign, surrounding Biden's final months in office, it makes sense that he took less of a public profile when it came to this kind of event. And personally, what I actually found most interesting about the Netanyahu speech that he pointed out since October 7th, because of the ramping up of Hezbollah attacks and attacks in northern Israel, that 80,000 people have fled from northern Israel, particularly into other parts of Israel. Now, he said internally displaced, but we know that there are several people who were also externally displaced and chose to leave the country of Israel as a result of the erupted tensions and eruption of combat in the country and surrounding the country as well. So it did seem a bit like a plea in order to secure northern Israel, and there's been rumors that he's gotten the green light to go further into southern Lebanon in order to engage Hezbollah. But like I said, that does remain to be seen. But while he went up there and gave his aggrandizing speech, self-aggrandizing speech, a lot of it did seem like a cry of desperation. The fact that while it might not seem like it, the war effort's not going well for Israel, especially Netanyahu's personal political career is not going well, and that he does need a bailout, and that he does need somebody to come in and pull him out of the fire, because otherwise, I'm not saying Israel is going to fall or anything, at least not at this point. I do think that their long-term perspectives are not very good when it comes to their continued existence as a nation, their continued prosperity as a nation. And I'm separating that from any sort of value judgment. This isn't about being pro or against Israel. This is just looking at the set of facts in front of us that the future does not look bright for Israel. And I do think in many ways a lot of the Israeli urgency is targeted towards that, and a lot of the response to October 7th and a lot of the responses when it comes to Lebanon and Hezbollah are also in regard to that as well. Now, moving on to other Middle Eastern news. On the other side of the Israeli Palestinian conflict, China has brokered a tentative deal between 14 factions within the Palestinian government, including Fatah in the West Bank and Hamas in the Gaza Strip, in order to form a unity government. Because the big push right now is to bring Gaza back under the rule of the Palestinian Authority. I mean, even Trump posted a letter that he received from Mahmoud Abbas, the president of the Palestinian Authority, as a result of his assassination attempt. And that's the first known correspondence between them since the Palestinian Authority ceased talking to Donald Trump in 2018, excuse me, after he moved the capital to Jerusalem. So that was an interesting breakthrough. Now, I know what you can say about the Palestinian Authority and what you can say about Abbas, the fact that they're the placation that Israel gives to the West Bank Palestinians in order to make them feel like they have a government, while also accepting every concession. But it does seem like, going back to China, they do have more substantial plans in order to bring about more unity among this issue, and that China is posturing itself against Israel right now. And while China and Israel historically have had good, decent relations in the past 30 years, since the end of the Cold War, with the opening of relations and especially trade relations, it does seem that with the direction the Middle East is taking, with Israel facing more and more challenges, and of course China having grown closer to Iran. I'm not saying the Iranians are dictating Chinese policy by any means, but just because of the way the dynamics in the region have changed, such as China actually trying to broker the Saudi-Iranian peace deal, the Saudi-Iranian detente deal, and working with other actors in the region in order to ease over some of the conflicts. Who knows, with some of the tensions between Turkey and Syria, we could see them play a major role in that. Now, I know that it's been a major goal of Russia in order to bring reconciliation between Turkey and Syria, and that is actually currently happening right now. Assad is meeting with Putin, and that is the main agenda item, especially after there were clashes between Turkish and Syrian forces in Idlib. So that right now is being smoothed over, and Putin's primary goal when it comes to the issue in Syria is to secure some sort of peace agreement between Turkey and Syria and the opening of particularly economic relations and diplomatic channels between the two countries in order to really close the book on the Syrian conflict and put out that fire, especially as the situation with Israel grows more and more out of hand, and the situation with the Iranians also continues to escalate. But this isn't the first time, going back to the Palestinian Unity Agreement, that a third party has tried to negotiate some sort of understanding between the Palestinians and the various Palestinian factions. I shouldn't say Palestinians as Israelis because that has been the subject of many failed negotiations, but when it comes to the internal politics of the Palestinian government, or what remains of the Palestinian government, there's been many failed attempts, especially since 2006, especially since Hamas became the dominant force in the Gaza Strip. And like I said, you even saw these raids earlier with Israel going into parts of the West Bank, arresting so-called Hamas affiliates. So I do think there is some concern about the tensions growing there, and that China does want to broker this. And realistically, from China's perspective, like I said, they're very economically intertwined with Israel. Now that has decreased over the past few years, to my understanding. But if they can form a more united Palestinian movement, that's what more negotiating power could you ask for Israel? Because the Israelis do not have the kind of lobby that they have in most Western countries in China. At least, like I said, not to my understanding. And I know a lot of that relies on diaspora population when it comes to the lobbying efforts. But I don't want to put too much stock in this because, like I said, these efforts have fallen through before. But given the relative success in the mending of Saudi and Iranian relations, I don't want to sour on it too much. I don't want to say, oh, it's completely impossible. This is never going to happen because, like I said, we've seen substantial progress towards that. Now, moving on with that, to round out the Middle Eastern news before I finish off with some domestic news out of the U.S., Blinken tells us that the Iranians are 2 weeks away from getting the nuke. They've been 2 weeks away from getting the nuke for 20 years, for 30 years even. But what do I know? But in all seriousness, I do think that the Iranians have ramped up their program in order to acquire a nuclear weapon because of the changing tensions. Of course, it would put them on a much more even footing with the Israelis. It would create something of mutually assured destruction between the two, where the Israelis certainly have them, despite them not admitting to it, and the Iranians would end up having them, which, like I said, I know that in terms of military strength, especially in an unconventional force, they have locked horns. They have been a relatively equal match for each other, that they've been able to pull operations on each other a number of times. But if the Iranians were to have their own nuclear deterrence, it would be a step up from what we had seen before, and it would create, I think, probably the closest thing we could have to parity between the two countries. And who knows, that might be a path in negotiations. But I do think, given Blinken's comments and given the direction of U.S. politics, despite Pajekian's statements towards wanting to salvage the JCPOA, the Iranians have found themselves in a position where they have really no choice but to continue their program if they're going to secure any sort of insurance against further action against them, especially if Trump is to return to office and if he is going to take as hardline of a middle stance on Israel and the Middle East as at least he's purporting to right now. I mean, you can look at some of J.D. Vance's statements on the issue of Iran, saying that if we hit them, we have to hit hard. We need to build a coalition of neighboring nations in order to put pressure on the Iranians and isolate them. Going back to Netanyahu's proposal, like I said, and that even goes back to the Trump era, trying to coalesce Israel with these various anti-Iran Arab nations into one coalition. And once again, the Saudis do continue their backdoor negotiations with the Israelis. time and time again. But I think it's going to take a lot more than whatever Trump can come in with an offer in order to get them to sever their ties to the Iranians. That the Saudis are ultimately playing both sides of this, as they often do, much like the Turks. But I do think that the Iranians, at this point, the current regime there, as a matter of self-preservation, they do have to attain a nuclear deterrence if they want any sort of even-handed negotiating power. And I don't think that we'll get a summit between Trump and the Iranians like we did with North Korea. But mind you, North Korea was only able to secure that summit because they did have the bargaining power of a nuclear deterrence. And while I don't think that there would have been a hot war with North Korea, the U.S. was in a much more volatile position when it came to making extractions from North Korea in the lead up to the meeting between Trump and Kim Jong Un. So, given the track record of disarmament from various nations, whether that have been Libya or Iraq, I think those are probably the main two, or even going back to Syria with its chemical weapons, and either successful or attempted regime change continuing, the Iranians at this point have no reason not to pursue any sort of deterrence like that. And will they actually? Like I said, they've been speculating this for 30 years, but given the global climate, there's little reason for them not to. And speaking of reconciliation of relations, reconciliation with Egypt has continued for the past several months with Iranian military experts who, once again, in terms of the region, the Iranians accelerate in missile capabilities, and with the tension in Gaza being right on the border of Egypt and fears of conflict spilling over, there's been an opening of relations between Egypt and Iran, which, like I said, Egypt was one of the first countries to really come out against the Iranian revolutions. And mind you, Egypt for a number of years now, uh, with some brief exceptions, has been the bastion of secular Arab nationalism. I know that you go back to Jamal Abdel Nasser. He was really the figurehead of that. I don't think he officially called himself a Ba'athist, but he was the head of the Arab nationalism, which had a much more secular character to it. And Mubarak carried on much in that tradition, and you could arguably say that Sisi, the current president of Egypt, has as well. And we're talking about the Revolutionary Islamic Republic. Now, I know at the end of the day, ideology only means so much against pragmatism, but you are seeing the mending of bridges that the United States lost so much power as a kingmaker in the Middle East, and that the Israelis have put themselves in such a vulnerable position where you have a lot of unlikely alliances forming, that you have a lot of unlikely mending of relations forming right now. And I think that will only continue, and I don't even think that, for example, Trump coming back into office could change the trajectory of that, because I think that too many things just on an overall level have shifted too much, that even if Trump were to be in his ideal form, even if he were to have the best negotiating team, everything that he promises, some things are just simply out of his hands at this point. Now, I want to move on with all of that being said, finally, to the news about Joe Biden. So, for the past several weeks, since the June 27th debates, Biden has been beleaguered as questions of his mental health have arrived. And, well, not mental health, but his cognitive health, I should say, because there's a certain connotation to mental health. It's not like he has. I think you know what I mean there. But in terms of his cognitive ability, in terms of question, is he suffering from either dementia, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's disease, etc.? Diseases of the mind that, of course, accelerate with age. Biden being 81 years old at this point. And with all of this, just 8 days after the assassination attempt on Trump and Trump's good showing at the RNC, even among people who aren't his biggest fans, Biden, after statements throughout that past 3-week period have come out, I'm not stepping down. It would take the Lord Almighty for himself for me to quit this race. Comes out on Saturday, his official Twitter, the Joe Biden's official Twitter account, publishes a letter stating that he wishes to withdraw from the 2020 race, and that, of course, Kamala has his full support, and It's been the honor of my lifetime to serve as president, blah, 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 blah. And that he'd be addressing the nation later that week. Of course, Wednesday night, we get the address of Biden, which is very incoherent, even by Biden standards. He never really addressed the point of why he's stepping down. He didn't say anything about cognitive decline. He didn't say anything about age or health or anything like that. And that's, of course, all of this is preceded by the fact that Biden got COVID, was out of the public spotlight for about a week, comes back Wednesday night, goes back to the White House from Delaware, and then gives this speech, which I don't want to speculate too much, but some people say it was pre-recorded, blah blah blah. They try to zoom in on his watch, saying that it's not set to the right time. Whatever. I don't think that's really relevant. But Biden gives a speech that doesn't really explain anything to anyone beyond the fact that he's quote unquote passing the torch to Kamala Harris and that she is the presumptive Democratic nominee. Now, there's been all kinds of speculation. Pretty much the day after this was announced, Democratic delegates put their full weight behind Kamala Harris to the point where she is the presumptive nominee. They're actually holding a vote before the convention, which is going to take place later in August, in order to confirm her as the nominee to avoid any sort of contested convention. Much to the chagrin of Obama, it had seemed, because the Clintons backed Kamala. She was their girl in the White House. Obama allegedly wanted somebody with more broad appeal, like Arizona Senator Mark Kelly. Nice, relatively moderate Democrat, sharp-looking white guy who can speak to the masses. Whereas Kamala Harris is going to have a very specific voter base. And as it stands now, according to the election betting odds, which are my most trusted source when it comes to calling these sort of elections, Trump has dropped out. I'm having a Biden moment myself. My apologies here. Biden is out. He's officially out of the race, and Trump is still leading the pack. Let me just pull up the current numbers right now. So, as it stands right now, as of today, as of this current time of recording, Trump stands at 59.2, Harris at 37.8, as well as just a variety of Democrats, any sort of last-minute convention switch they could make, which I doubt is going to happen. But as it stands now, Kamala Harris is the presumptive nominee, and it does look like there was a compromise within the Democratic Party because the speculated vice presidential candidate is Mark Kelly, who I'd said that seemed to be the favorite of the Obamas. Now, it goes back to the question of the different influences within the Democratic Party. Some are wondering whether this election is still salvageable. Some are wondering if Congress can be saved from this election, if even if they have to concede to Trump, they can still pull this off and win in the House, or possibly cause an upset in the Senate where the Republicans are favored just because of the number of seats that are up for election, just because of the seats that happen to be up for election this election cycle. But frankly, just discuss the tactics of this. And yes, Joe Biden was a walking train wreck when it came to optics. There was really no worse candidate you could have in that regard, simply because of the fact that the man had greatly lost his mental faculties, that he is an 81-year-old man who has suffered as a result of aging, as many of us do, as many of us one day probably will. Somebody that, regardless of what they believe, regardless of how much you might agree with them, how much you might like them, you can concede at that point is incapable of holding such an important office. So, with that, they pressured him to resign. I think it was completely under pressure. I don't think it was something that he wanted to do. Whether they had some sort of... whether they used the carrot or the stick, so to speak, I don't know. But they had some method in order to make him step down from the office, in which he said in his speech that my actions warrant a second term. He clearly didn't want to step down, but at a certain point, I think it was just deemed inviolable, and he lost too much support of his own party, or some sort of backdoor dealing took place, which eventually led to him saying he'll continue through the end of his term, he'll serve out the rest of his term, but he'll quote-unquote pass the torch. But with all that being said, the question of Harris as why she was chosen, of course, her being the vice presidential nominee, makes her best fit to assume the position of running for president from there. especially when it comes to intricacies with campaign finance, etc., etc. But some people question: is she there just to throw the election? Is she their ringer? Is she somebody who is going to have to take the L for the Democratic Party, and maybe she'll get her chance in 2028? Or is this somebody they think they can actually bring into the office? So far, I know there has been an initial polling surge, but you look at just the reality of the situation. Like I said, I trust betting odds far more than I trust polls because they're usually, I mean, a lot of these are, like I said, what people do bet on. Some people might say I over rely on them. After all, they called 2016 for Hillary initially, but I think that was a mistake a lot of us made back in the day. But given what we know about Kamala, she doesn't command the coalition, and that even when it comes to undecided voters, as many grievances as they might have with Trump, Kamala does not draw new people into the coalition either. And what we'll likely get in this case is low voter turnout, which I think was going to be the case anyway, that a lot of the undecideds are just going to stay their hand this election and have no part in it, which, I mean, I sympathize with, frankly. But even to compare this to previous elections, so 2016, you look at the demographics that went for Trump. He got the majority of the white vote, of course. He even got the majority of white women at that point. Hillary failed to turn out the people she was supposed to be the champion of. Even a lot of the minority vote stayed home. A lot of Hispanic voters stayed home. A lot of black voters stayed home. And this is 2016. And then you had 2020. Once again, Trump actually increased his margins with everyone except white men in the exit polls when everything was said and done. And now we're moving into 2024. And in my opinion, I know, like I said, there was an initial spike in polling, but I think that's just because of the upheaval that took place in the past few days. I don't see Kamala being able to pull the same amount of support from the coalition. And like I said, I'm not saying that Trump is going to sweep the minority vote. I'm not going to say he's going to be the first Republican to win the black vote in probably over a century. I don't know the exact numbers, or that he's going to flip the Hispanic vote or whatever. But point being is, I see Kamala drawing out less voter turnout from her side, or even the undecideds, than either Hillary or Biden. And this is probably the worst candidate they could have gone with. And I know that there's the speculation that perhaps she's there to lose and the establishment has made its peace with Trump, which like I said, I'm actually sympathetic to that argument. I'm actually sympathetic to the idea that, yeah, they've made their peace and that they'll accept Trump and they'll actually let Trump bear the responsibility and take the fall. I don't think he'll be voluntarily doing it, but they'll pin the blame, I should say, of the failure of things like Ukraine or escalation of conflict in the Middle East on Donald Trump. Say you could have voted for the Democrats, look what you did. If you just went for Hillary in 2016, none of this would ever happened. If you just would have accepted that he should have stepped down after 2020 and should not have run again, this would have never happened. And like I said, at the end of the day, he's the perfect scapegoat for them. They can blame him for a lot of things. And then who knows, they may drag out Mark Kelly or Gavin Newsom or one of these, let's just say, more broad appeal candidates. I mean, even somebody like Whitmer in Michigan, I know a lot of people dislike her, but even I think she could bring out more of a broad appeal than, say, Kamala Harris could. Or, frankly, when it comes to just all of the potential candidates that the Democrats could have run, it's the worst crop of it. And I'm not even saying this is somebody who supports the Democrats, but electorally speaking, I don't think it could have really been any worse. And you could say that there might be fortification in this election. There might be some sort of insurance that everyone can get their vote counted no matter what. Naturally, because that's how democracy works. But I have a hard time believing that the establishment hasn't made some degree of peace with Trump and are willing to let him, like I said, go in there and even, take the hit for a lot of things that are going to go wrong in the next 4 years, regardless. And that at this point, the Democrats don't want to invest too much in the presidential race because it's more or less a foregone conclusion, and that they can take the L, they can let Trump be the bad guy for 4 years, and they can come in to save the day. But getting on to, I think, much more interesting Biden territory beyond inane electoral politics is a recent act that he signed during his absence. So I will switch over to our other tab here in order to share this article. So this is from the official White House website as of July 22nd, 2024. Memorandum on the delegation of certain functions and authorities under the Rebuilding Economic Prosperity and Opportunity for Ukrainians Act. So this was an act signed by Biden on the 22nd of July. Memorandum for the Secretary of State, the Secretary of the Treasury, subject delegation of certain functions and authorities under the Rebuilding Economic Prosperity and Opportunity for Ukrainians Act, by the authority invested in me as President by the Constitution and the laws of the United States of America, including Section 301 of Title III United States Code 1, I hereby order as follows. Section 1A, I hereby delegate to the Secretary of the Treasury the functions and authorities vested in the President by Sections 104A1 and 104A2A, the Rebuilding Economic Prosperity and Opportunities for Ukrainians Act, Division F, Public Law 118 through 50, the Act. B, I hereby delegate to the Secretary of State, in consultation with the Secretary of the Treasury, the functions and authorities vested by the President in Section 104G, 104I, 105C, 105E, and 105G of the Act. Section 2, the delegations in this memorandum shall apply to any provision of any future public law that are the same or substantially the same as those provisions referenced in the memorandum. Section 3, the Secretary of the Treasury is authorized to direct and publish the memorandum in the Federal Register. So, interesting that Biden has actually delegated many of his presidential authorities to Antony Blinken, the Secretary of State, and Janet Yellen, the Secretary of the Treasury, both who have been pivotal figures when it comes to supporting the war in Ukraine and have been the main mouthpieces of Biden, next up there with Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, when it comes to prosecuting the war in Ukraine or supporting the war in Ukraine, I should say, for the sake of officiality. But like I said, that was signed during Biden's public appearance, and when he had, of course, the very odd phone call into the Kamala Harris rally, and just the uncertainty of those past few days there. And with all of that, like I said, he has delegated more and more of his responsibility to cabinet members. I understand that's the point of cabinet members, but an unprecedented amount, to my understanding of American history, of authority to his cabinet members in order to support Ukraine in particular. I'm sure this also spills into other areas of governance, that more and more of his powers are being delegated to a Regency Council, for lack of a better word, and that Biden has resigned himself to the end of the term to serve out as a figurehead, and that any sort of decision-making, whatever little decision-making he still had at this point, has been waved away to others. And this will probably continue. But what is interesting is the speculation that Biden is going to resign, which, I mean, the way he started his speech, honestly, sounded like a resignation speech on Wednesday. But he didn't ultimately go through with it. But the question is if Biden is mentally incapable of running again. If his cognitive decline is that severe, then is he capable of serving out the rest of his term? That's the big question that everyone's asking. But with all the speculations in place, and with Kamala Harris running for president, it is interesting because both Blinken and Sullivan have said that once Biden's out of the White House, they're done. They quit. Now, that could just be some sort of backdoor power play negotiating tactics within the cabinet, trying to get Kamala to concede on a certain issue, or just, like I said, internal politics. Or it could be much more serious. But like I said, all of this is in the context of foreign leaders are calling Trump. They're meeting with Trump. They're accepting this man as the presumptive next president. And they're casting Biden aside. Like I said, Netanyahu may have met with Biden, but he met with Trump. And that's what made the headlines. And more or less everyone has accepted that Trump is the done deal at this point. And that Biden is just riding out the rest of his term, delegating more and more powers to the cabinet, away from actually his wife at this point, if you're to believe some speculations. And this is what's going to continue forward. And like I said, America is under a Regency Council right now. Nobody is really in charge, and this will continue on to the future. And who knows what they'll do within the next 6 months. And like I said, I'm not even saying this is somebody who's a big Trump guy or optimistic that he'll make that much of a difference, but how many roadblocks are they going to put in place for when the next person assumes office, whether that be Kamala Harris or Trump? I think these are all questions worth asking. And a lot of questions have been raised this week. More questions have been raised than have been answered. In which case, I will try to keep you posted on whatever answers come out and not bore you with endless speculation. But that's really all I had for today. So thank you everyone for tuning in once again, and have a good one. We'll see you next time.